Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? Double header for you today. I finished reading a book called A Land So Strange, and it reminded me of another book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. Even though I speak Spanish and I heard the author's name on this book a couple of times, I'm forgetting it off the top of my head, so you'll just have to look at the thumbnail for the author of A Land So Strange. I had a bit of a longer route today. I had to drive out to the eastern half of Oklahoma. Very beautiful with all the rain that we've had. It's very lush and very green. There's also a lot of wildlife crossing these remote rural two-lane highways, which sadly means a lot of roadkill. I swerved to not hit a couple of turtles that were crossing the highway. Unfortunately, I saw a lot more turtle roadkill than that. And I also saw at one of my stops these two just beautiful, very affectionate black labs that were just hanging out in the shade next to a convenience store. The owner said that somebody just drove out there, dropped them off, and drove away, which infuriates me to no end. My wife grew up in the country, and my in laws still live out there in rural Idaho, and that happens with infuriating regularity. And I didn't I wasn't in a position to do anything about the dog, so I just gotta hope that on the kindness of strangers they get taken care of out there. That always just it gets me up in my feelings. And on top of that, reading this book, A Land So Strange, and remembering Sebastian Junger's book Tribe, it's just got me thinking some stuff. A Land So Strange is about a Spaniard explorer from the 16th century. His last name was Cabeza de Vaca, which literally means cow's head. And in order to understand the importance of his journey and what he accomplished, you have to understand contextually a little bit about what was going on with the Spanish Empire and its continual growth in colonization of the Americas. This mostly takes place in the 1530s, so Spain's discovery in the New World is around 30 years old, and 40 years old at this point. 1492 was Columbus arriving, and then so the 1520s was when a lot of these initial voyages kicked off, and Spanish ships arriving in the Caribbean became much more commonplace. And the author gives you an idea of what that process was like. The value of a pilot. These pilots were kind of lower class and uneducated. The majority of them couldn't even write their names, but they were highly skilled at the art of pilotage by dead reckoning. Um, a layman like myself would get out on the water and would see only water, but these are guys that can read the ocean, read it against the sky, the stars, whatever, and they know exactly how to get to where they're going. Like, it's a fascinating trade to me. Another thing that I thought was interesting was them talking about the average lifespan of a sailing vessel once they put it into the water, between just the conditions of the ocean eating it up and the beating that these crappy old wooden ships took in the 1600s, or the 1500s, excuse me, 16th century 1500s. This is 100 years before the Mayflower, so this technology, we'll say, is a century older, even though rapid growth iterations weren't really a thing. It's a century older than a lot of the other stuff that I'm familiar with from centuries ago. The average lifespan of one of these sailing vessels was only 4 years. They'd sail out, they'd get all beat up and barnacled and everything, and they'd pull them back into port in Sevilla in Spain, and they'd have to work with the tide to get these ships onto their sides a little bit. When the tide goes out, they got to work fast and furious to scrape off all the old barnacles, patch up any holes, tar them and everything, let it dry, and then hopefully it's all cured by the time the tide comes back in. And then with the next tide, do it on the other half of the ship. Like, stuff like that, details like that, learning about processes and how things were done in a much more analog age. I've always thought that was cool. And it was neat that the author included those details to explain how the world worked back then. But with what they did know and what they didn't know, Spanish sailing vessels would often get themselves into trouble. And one thing that none of them knew early on, especially in the 1520s, in this era of exploration, was about the Gulf Stream, which was a massively powerful ocean current that came off of Florida and the Gulf and the Caribbean and everything. And even if you had, full sails out and a full head of wind behind you, the Gulf Stream was like 10 times more powerful than that, and it would just push your ship way off course. And so the ship that Cabeza de Vaca was on when he went on this exploration into the Americas ended up 900 miles off course because the Gulf Stream just pushed them way off of where they thought they were. The ship crashed in the Caribbean. And this is where I'll admit, like with my listening and stuff and me working a new route, I kind of missed a few details here and there. I think they wrecked either in Cuba or on the very southernmost tip of Florida. But either way, like, it's important to understand they ended up in Florida. And Cabeza de Vaca and 3 of his compatriots ended up just walking up the peninsula and then across the south, effectively, and then ending up in Texas and what is modern day northern Mexico, northeast Mexico. It took them years, and they spent a fair amount of that time in Indian captivity and slavery. And they were able to record some of their details of their journey. Well, I say they. It was mainly Cabeza de Vaca, and the main thrust of the account is basically about all of that. It's a short enough book that I don't want to give away too much of what he went through. But the main takeaway at the end was that he brought a very different perspective back to Spain when he escaped his captivity and was eventually returned to the Spanish. And in this era that overlapped with Columbus and Bartolomé de las Casas, the perspective that he brought was unique and valuable, but often unheeded. There were fantastic, powerful forces within the empire, both spiritual and imperial and economic, pushing for more and more expansion and conquest into the New World, not just for land, but also for resources and also for the religion. A lot of this push was to convert the Indians to Catholicism. And Cabeza de Vaca, he was a powerful voice in acting as an Indian advocate for their souls, not just looking at them as human-shaped animals, but saying, hey, these are people, and we need to give them the same considerations that we would give to other Spaniards. The book goes into some detail about just how much or how little that advice and that opinion was heeded. Whenever Bartolomé de las Casas comes up, I just remember that, again, and whenever I talk about this, whether it was on the podcast or here on the channel, I never mentioned the cartoonist that did this, but years ago there was a cartoonist who decided that he was going to try to spearhead a popular internet historical movement against Columbus by trying to get everybody to celebrate Bartolomé de las Casas in October instead. And I don't think he did all of his homework, because while Bartolomé de las Casas was an advocate for Indian rights and Indian liberation and saying, like, hey, let's not turn these indios into slaves, his solution was to instead raid Africa and capture the blacks and drag them to America and use them for slave labor instead, which was a huge, we'll say generously, it was a faux pas. This wasn't the beginning of the African slave trade. But if you're going to say, like, hey, here's this humanitarian guy, like, no, Bartolomé de las Casas was arguing this on spiritual grounds, much in the same way that Cabeza de Vaca was. But his solution to the economic value that would have been deprived from the loss of Indian slaves was to say, like, I keep thinking of that line from Blazing Saddles. I'm going to hell for this. Like, no, the horses are too valuable. Send a couple of, the rest. Anyway, I think it was somebody in the comments of my Thor Heyerdahl video, the Kon-Tiki book, that recommended I check out Cabeza de Vaca. And it was a figure in history that I'd never heard of. And if the author of this book is to be believed, he was at one point studied more regularly, and he was more better known. Sorry, my brain's tired. I did another 60 hours this week. He was more widely known, especially in Latin America, than, say, Hernán Cortés. But narratives changed, focus changed, whatever, and now little kids learn more about the impact of Hernan Cortez because ultimately, in the end, the conquistadors and their methodology won out over the type of stuff that Cabeza de Vaca was advocating. And so history is written by the victors, but you also study the people that generated the system that ultimately led to where we are. So, while Cabeza de Vaca was saying, like, hey, let's do this and be a little bit more humane in how we treat these people, I lived among various tribes of them for years, and I know how they operate, versus a guy like Cortez going in there and saying, no, let's kill them and take their stuff, and the survivors get to be Catholic, or else. The Empire was more on board with one of those outcomes than the other, and the rest is literally history. The reason why I mentioned this book in conjunction with Tribe by Sebastian Junger, which I read 5 years ago, fantastic book. I remember mostly that it talks about how people kind of form in groups. Often there's an overlap between their ethnicity and their ideology, but there are times when people ideologically align outside of their ethnicity. And one phenomenon that kept popping up, and this is what Cabeza de Vaca's story reminded me of, was during the colonial era and the frontier era, like the westward expansion era, so 1700s to 1800s in North America, there was a repeated phenomenon of whites who, whether they willingly left or they were captured and then like kind of went native by captured by Native Americans, they would go live amongst Indians for a while. And when it came time for them to be, quote unquote, rescued, however you want to put that, and brought back to American society, they didn't want to do it. They preferred the way of life amongst the Indians. Obviously, this wasn't the universal experience, but it happened with enough regularity that it was worth recording and noting. And that same thing basically happened to Cabeza de Vaca, even at the end of a couple of his years of captivity. It depended on which tribe he was traveling amongst. Kind of like Kit Carson. Like, hey, do the Indians like Kit Carson? It depends on which Indians. The Shoshones? Sure. He even married one of them. The Navajos? Oh, I've got a book for you on that one. But anyway, this was fascinating. 5 stars for A Land So Strange. I'm going to grab a print copy for the library. This was worth studying, and because it was short and because there were a couple of details here and there that I missed while I was working, I'm sure that I'll read it again down the road. Maybe not this year, but it'll be worth revisiting. I find the conquistador era of history to also be intriguing, but it's like the Mayflower and the Plymouth era and the Pilgrim era. It's like the 1600s before I really started reading up on that. All I had was this very loose idea of the bullet points of it, like, okay, there were Algonquins in North America, and then eventually the English started coming over. Well, 100 years before that, you had the Mexica and a whole bunch of other tribes in the Caribbean and in the south of what is now the United States, and the conquistadors and the Spanish came over. It was not as simple as that. There were a lot more conflicting forces. The ones we study are just the ones that ended up winning out. And books like this are helping me to kind of clarify the pixels in my head of what that time period looked like. So a hearty endorsement to that, and you can check it out. I'll put an affiliate link in the description. And if you're a member on Audible, the audiobook is included in the Plus catalog. So a fantastic book. Like I said, 5 stars. I might put it on the best of the year list. Aún queda por ver. Bueno, pues gracias por escuchar. Que conducís con seguridad y allá os veré. Hasta luego.